Often things are not quite what they seem. If you aren't an expert in a certain discipline, you usually don't know what truly goes into the formation of that discipline. Let me explain. In class several months ago, I showed you how I could play complicated scales quickly. My point was that sometimes you must do what seems the opposite. In this case, practice slowly in order to develop the ability to play quickly. As a musician, I find that some who are not musicians have no knowledge of what happens behind the scenes before you get to enjoy the end product. There are some songs that took me over a year of practice before I could confidently play them. And some are only 3 or 4 minutes long. When you see a musician perform, do you realize the amount of time and persistence that went into the product you get to enjoy? I'm reminded of a doctor my wife saw and discarded when we lived in South Carolina. My wife's mom was a nurse who stayed on top of current medical research and talked about it at home. And my wife is amazing at staying up to date on new research. After visiting this doctor, she came home discouraged. The appointment was a waste of time because the answers she got were from research that was at least 20 years old. Now we look for doctors who not only learned well in the past, but make it a priority to keep learning. Do you think about the amount of time outside of your appointment that a good doctor has to spend to keep up to date? Let's turn to pastors and teachers. In my Bible for Teachers class at college, the professor said that any given Bible lesson should take a minimum of 8 hours in preparation. My initial reaction was, that has to be an overstatement. So fast forward 25 years. Even with all the technological tools at my disposal, I find it almost always takes me longer than 8 hours for each lesson. And that is nothing compared to how long it takes if I'm giving a presentation or a sermon. On the low end, I invest at least 16 hours in focused study and prep time. I usually spend 20 to 30 hours. I remember hearing a prominent pastor say that he built 16 to 24 hours into his week just for sermon prep. And this is after decades of preaching. Seems like a lot for a 45-minute talk. I once had a church member at my previous church ask what I did between Sundays. It was a sadly funny question because I constantly tried to keep myself from working more than 50 hours a week. My wife worked at a church in college where the senior pastor easily worked 80 hours a week, but what most of the church saw amounted to about 5 hours of it. Pastors, depending on their position, have to be ready for discipleship opportunities, counseling moments, leadership meetings, funerals, weddings, and currently learning to become an expert at communicating digitally. And to be a responsible teacher, they must keep up on current trends in scholarship, current events, and work to understand a rapidly changing culture so they can accurately apply the Bible in their current context. In other words, pastors can't just learn a few elementary arguments for simplistic points and call it done. Let's apply this in our own church. When you see Pastor Ben preach on Sunday morning, do you think about the work, time, and prayer that happened behind the scenes first? So, what is my point? Is it simply to be more understanding and appreciative? No. I mean, understanding this stuff is great, but my point is that we often only see a sliver of what goes on behind the scenes. I mean, some people just wing it and make it up as they go, but you wouldn't really trust a doctor who did that, would you? Now, God is working behind the scenes in ways that we cannot see or comprehend. And at this point in the story of the Bible, we have seen this truth over and over again. And how do people respond? Most often, they are not patient enough, or do they trust God enough to give him the benefit of the doubt? When he doesn't produce results according to our expectations or timeline, they complained, doubted, and threw accusations. The great nation has risen and fallen, and exiled people get to regain some sort of cultural and religious order, though they are not autonomous. Then silence. We might assume that God stopped working, that he is doing nothing. But what have we learned? God is always working. Last week we looked at a verse from Acts 17. God gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. So the Lord is always working. When we can't see it, we can trust that he is working behind the scenes. And we are fortunate to have the Bible, to be able to put the pieces of history together, to continually see how God fulfilled his promises. I'm amazed at everything God has done. We can trust and understand that if God has always been working and fulfilling his promises, then he is still working today. He's working supernaturally with his divine wisdom and working for our eternal good. This is good news. I want you to think about a couple questions. What would it look like if you lived a life of trust? Trusting God's promises. And what would happen if that trust led you to look around you for what God is doing? Would it lead to more involvement in the work of God if you trusted that even taking what seems like a worldly risk, it would lead to your eternal good?